Hi, welcome to a little lecture about the history of the Food and Drug Administration. It's sort of important to talk about. We've had the Food and Drug Administration around for a long time now, and it's sort of part of every American's everyday life. Well, it is if you work in clinical research anyway. But sort of how do we get to the point where we are today? The history is really always interesting. However, some of you might be thinking right now, the reason I like clinical research and I'm exploring it is because I don't like history. So already you're disappointed. But I promise you this is a very brief and hopefully interesting bit of information and perspective. So why do we need history in a research class? History is important. It helps us understand all sorts of things, and it gives us a really nice context and a background for our world to have meaning. So we get to understand how our society evolved to where we are today, what our values are today, how did they come to be, how did they evolve, what is our moral compass as a society, what do we value and how do we behave, and our own identity. So this will help you in a way to get a bit of a handle on why clinical research is conducted the way it is. We will talk a lot more about the history of sort of important events that happened when we get into the ethics of clinical research in 1374. But today we're just going to talk about how the FDA came into existence. So prior to the 20th century, laws were really only about safeguarding consumers, and they were very local and product specific. So you can imagine at the birth of our country, there would be laws in Boston, for example, that might be very different than Williamsburg, Virginia, because those were geographically at the time, due to transportation, they were not close to each other, and the laws were very specific to products. The whole idea was then to sort of safeguard from the marketer's perspective their products. 1848 was the very first sort of widespread law. The 1848 Drug Importation Act addressed the entry of adulterated drugs from overseas. It was very difficult at this time to sort of manage and enact regulations about goods that traveled locally, but we could do something about drugs that came into our ports. And that was sort of the very first national federal drug law that was in place. 1906 was a big year. Upton Sinclair published a book called The Jungle. The Jungle was his sort of take on the difficulties of the working class immigrants in our country, and it was really a call for socialism, and he wrote the book as a political statement. But what happened is people read it and they got very upset about what happened in meatpacking plants, because in his book, meatpacking plants were sort of the employer for many of the characters in his book. So instead of really getting the message about socialism that he was trying to sort of get people to think about, people then just got concerned from a consumer perspective and said meatpacking plants were unsanitary, they were horrible, and they were a real shock to a lot of people. So Upton Sinclair, his book unintendedly sort of started, it was the impetus for the Food and Drug Act of 1906. This law prohibited interstate commerce in misbranded and adulterated foods and drugs. I mentioned the 1848 Act, that just protected drugs that came into our ports, but this law said you cannot engage in interstate commerce with things that are misbranded. So the law prohibited false claims about the ingredients or the identity of a drug, and it emphasized the regulation of labeling. So it was all about the consumer knowing what they were getting, that the label had to be accurate and it had to correctly identify what was included in that product. And nothing about, there was no FDA approval process at this point. It was just about, do consumers know what they're getting when they buy this? The Shirley Amendment of 1912 then brought therapeutic claims within this Food and Drug Act of 1906. It required the government to provide the claims to be false. So the label, it had to be, if it was incorrect, and fraudulent before something could be considered illegal. Now this is really tricky. Now you could say the label is false. That's a little more black and white. Fraudulent is intending to be deceitful. So to say something is fraudulent implies motive. It states that there was knowledge that this was a deceptive act. So this gets a little bit tricky, but at least it was a step in the right direction. The Shirley Amendment was trying to say you have to bring therapeutic claims, they have to be correct. In 1937, there was a big problem with sulfanilamide. Sulfanilamide is an antibiotic that is used to treat strep infections. And it was really commonly used at the time in the 20s and 30s. And so there was Massengill, the drug company, decided that they could make sulfanilamide in an oral form that would be easy for children to swallow, so a liquid form as opposed to tablet or powder. And so a chemist compounded the sulfanilamide in something called diethylene glycol and sent that out to the public. It was nice, it was an elixir, kids could swallow it easily, had a very nice taste to it. And so the chemist came up with this, sent it to the public. Now, if at this time you're Googling diethylene glycol, or if you happen to just know that diethylene glycol is antifreeze, and it is highly poisonous to humans. It tastes great, and it kills you by kidney failure. So it worked. It was an elixir that could be swallowed easily, but it was fatal. 107 deaths. Many that were established. There might be more than that, and many of them were children. So this, you can imagine, is a huge problem. So this was the very first time that, and this was distributed nationwide, that this story reached a lot of headlines, and it sort of established the need for the drugs to be known to be safe before they're marketed. So it was correctly labeled as diethylene glycol, so there was no breaking of the law there, because the law didn't say that it had to be safe before you sold it. The law just said that the claims have to be correct and that the label has to include what's in there, but it didn't say anything about safety. So this is the very first time that as a nation we said, oh my gosh, maybe there should be something on the books about keeping things safe. So that's how we got the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act of 1938. And this was the very first time we put into law in this country, new drugs have to be safe before you can sell them. This law also extended the authority of the government to include cosmetics and medical therapeutic devices. Also, penalties before was that the government could seize medications and they could prosecute pharmaceutical companies, but now the court had a lot more teeth, so the court had the ability to impose injunctions. And also the FD&C Act of 1938 required that safe tolerances be set for unavoidable poisonous substances. And you're thinking, really? Unavoidable poisonous substances? But that was really due to manufacturing practices at the time. There are also things, you actually do already see things in your labeling now related to the FD&C Act of 1938, which has been subsequently updated. But if you ever look at labeling and you see that an item you're buying has FD&C red number 3, that's because of this. That's what FD&C means, food, drug, and cosmetic. So it was a very, very large, big overhaul of a lot of things that are about the medications that we use. In 1952, there was a medication that's still on the market now called chloramphenicol, and that is a broad-spectrum antibiotic. And it was found, and now we understand, that chloramphenicol actually can cause your bone marrow to behave sort of poorly. And they, through a lot of research and a lot of detective work, came to the conclusion that nearly 180 cases of often fatal blood diseases occurred because of chloramphenicol. And this is really important. This is really good for consumers because this established the development of a voluntary reporting system to the FDA, which we still use today. So in these cases of blood dyscrasia that occurred in relationship to this medication, it's very, very hard for individual physicians to see what is happening on a big, big scale. So a doctor in San Francisco has a patient who gets chloramphenicol and then develops this blood disease. And the same thing happens to someone in Kansas City and a physician in Tampa. But when you start looking at all these cases all over the country, you can start to see the pattern, but it requires a voluntary reporting system to be able to find the pattern. So now we have a voluntary reporting system, which we'll talk about more later, and which is really good for consumers because then you can start to see the overall pattern of things that are happening. Thalidomide era. And thalidomide was, to sort of back up a little bit here, thalidomide, some of you might have already be aware of this, but this was a drug that was developed in Europe in the late 50s, and it was used for morning sickness. So women who had very bad morning sickness would take thalidomide. Thalidomide would cause a lot of drowsiness, and they would sleep after they took their thalidomide. By the time they woke up late in the morning around lunchtime, their morning sickness would have passed and they would have felt better. The bad thing about this is that thalidomide we now know is an anti-angiogenesis drug. So it prevents vascular systems from developing. So women who are pregnant would then have this really very serious adverse event passed on to their developing fetus. And so if you were to Google and look at pictures of thalidomide babies, you'll see that they have missing limbs or very, very seriously deformed limbs. And it was because the thalidomide prevented the development of blood vessels. So long story short, thalidomide was also introduced into this country, but there wasn't really any legislation, there weren't any regulations on the book that say, how do we handle drugs that aren't really known to work? And so the Kefauver-Harris Drug Amendment was a response to the thalidomide. And in 1962, this went into effect, and it made sure that the drug works, so drug efficacy, does the drug work? And again, adding on another layer of evaluating drug safety. So manufacturers then, in response to this 1962 legislation, are required to prove to the FDA the effectiveness of the drug before marketing them. So back to the earlier event with the antibiotic, the sulfanilamide, we wanted to make sure it was safe before we marketed it, and now this amendment says you have to make sure that there's effectiveness. And this also allowed the FDA to have closer control over investigational drug studies, and inspectors were granted access to additional company records. So the FDA now has some ability to go in and look at things. So this was a very large and very important amount of legislation. New patient enhancement strategy. The Orphan Drug Act of 1983 was passed. This was designed to promote research and marketing of drugs for rare diseases. And when I say rare diseases, in the United States, that's defined by law as diseases that affect 200,000 or fewer people a year. Different countries have different standards for what they consider to be a rare disease. But in the United States, it's less than 200,000 people a year. Now, there's some really good things about that, and you're thinking, who really cares, Heather? There's some advantages to the sponsor. So pharmaceutical sponsors, so imagine a drug company, why would you want to devise a drug for someone if you're not going to sell that much of it? There's a lot of expense that goes into developing a new drug. If you're going to get very little out of it, why would you do it? If very few people need this drug, why would you do it? So the Drug Act was designed to have some advantages for the sponsor. And one was a tax incentive. So there was a big financial motivator to go ahead and develop orphan drugs. And then enhanced patent protections. So pharmaceutical companies want to not only sell a medication, but they want to be the only one that sells that medication. So patents are provided they're applied for and provided typically for new drugs. So the Orphan Drug Act says not only will you get a patent, you'll get an extra long patent. So you will have a protection in the market to be the only person that sells that drug for a long time. So this is why it's really important that you have the Orphan Drug Act of 1983. I don't have any rare diseases, but there are times, and I don't want you to learn these, but I'm giving you some examples why orphan drugs are really important. So I don't have a rare disease now, but acetaminophen overdose, so a Tylenol overdose, they're not common, but they can be fatal. So acetadote would be the medications that would be indicated if I had a Tylenol overdose. If I got bit by a North American carotid snake, I would want to have the anti-venom medication Crofab. So you can see there are lots of times where orphan drugs are really important to the health and welfare of people with rare diseases. So we'll talk a little bit about expanded patient access initiatives. So now we have a lot of things on the books by which patients are kept safe. We talked about the phase 1 through 4 studies, right? And so we have now, all these regulations are starting to come into place that sort of define what clinical research looks like now. And in the 1980s and the 1990s, with the big widespread epidemic of AIDS, patients started saying, well, you know, we have all these regulations in place to keep people safe, to make sure the drug works, to make sure the drug is safe before it's marketed, but maybe I really want to get access to clinical trials early. So the very first sort of thing happened in 1987 was the FDA revised regulations to expand access to experimental drugs for patients with untreatable serious diseases. And again, the hallmark one that comes to mind is AIDS. There was no treatment for AIDS when it first became widespread. And so the FDA said, okay, we still have the regulations that are going to say we're not going to market a drug until we prove conclusively that it's safe and that it's effective. But if you have an untreatable serious disease, AIDS, advanced terminal cancer, things like that, maybe we could make it so you could get access to these drugs a little bit easier. Then in 1991, the FDA published regulations to accelerate reviews of drugs for life-threatening diseases. Not only were patients able to get into the trials a little bit easier, but the FDA said there's going to be a special fast pass lane for life-threatening diseases. Because if you're a patient and you're a person that has a life-threatening disease, you don't have a lot of time typically to wait for the bureaucratic wheels of the federal government to turn. So the FDA said we're going to put a thing in place for life-threatening diseases that we will look and we will review this at an accelerated rate. And then in 2007, the Abigail Alliance versus von Eschenbach. This was really sort of a landmark. It was a big watershed case for people that argued that patients should have access to investigational drugs before they were approved by the FDA. Abigail and the Abigail Alliance was a college student who developed head and neck cancer, which is very uncommon in young people, and she wanted to gain access to a monoclonal antibody called Erbitux. It's now available on the market, but it was in clinical trials at that time, and she did not qualify for participation in any of the clinical trials because it was only being studied in colorectal cancer, not head and neck cancer. And so there was an alliance that was established to sort of be a patient advocacy group that said patients should have access to this. And so Abigail Alliance sued von Eschenbach, who was a commissioner of the FDA at the time, and said, it is a constitutional right for me to be able to have access to investigational drugs. And it was overturned by the state Supreme Court, and then the U.S. Supreme Court refused to hear it. So it was established that we as a society, and from a legal perspective, are granting people the ability to get drugs for life-threatening and serious diseases faster and easier, but it's not a constitutional right. So that's sort of where we are now with regards to expanded patient access initiatives. 1992, then, there was a Prescription Drug User Fee Act, and you will hear people call it PDUFA. And so PDUFA of 1992 required the sponsors, the drug and biological manufacturers, so study sponsors, to pay fees in order to do the IND and the NDA, so the investigational new drug and the new drug application. So it is a pay system. So the FDA started to realize that, whoa, we're doing all this reviewing and we're doing a lot of work, and it's all on the taxpayer dollar. But the FDA said, you know, sponsors, it would be really fair and reasonable if you kicked in a little bit too, because you're going to be the ones that get to sell this drug. So the sponsors now have to pay money, and there's different fees for different activities. And then in response, the FDA has to use those funds to hire more reviewers. So more people to look at the investigational new drug applications, more people to look at the new drug applications, things like that. So the FDA couldn't just take that money and blow it on something. Couldn't go on spring break with it. The FDA had to use the funds to hire more reviewers, and additionally, and this is pretty smart, the FDA is required to meet certain performance benchmarks primarily related to the speed of approval. So not only could the FDA not blow this money on fun stuff, the FDA was then held accountable for how fast they were getting the approvals done. Because you can hire more reviewers and still move like a snail. So the FDA now has benchmarks that says how quickly are you reviewing and getting these approvals done. Then there was the Food and Drug Administration Modernization Act of 1997. So that 1938 Act, FD&C, was huge. This was an update to it. Included things like measures to accelerate review of medical devices. In this class, we're really going to be talking about drugs, medications, but there are also practices for the review of medical devices. So if you were to get a pacemaker, that would be a very good example of a device that the FDA would approve. 1997 update also included regulations regarding advertising unapproved uses of approved drugs and devices. So if that drug was approved for rheumatoid arthritis, the sponsor that owns the drug could only advertise it for rheumatoid arthritis, even if that drug really worked well for gout, let's say, for example. So remember what I said before about the IND. So if that drug is approved for rheumatoid arthritis, that sponsor cannot say anything about other indications, although doctors will use drugs for other indications. Also included regulations about health claims for foods, which would have to be in agreement with published data by a reputable public health source. So this is about the labeling on your vitamins, for example, and then the development of good guidance practices for agency decision making. So the FDA is a big federal agency, but there are field offices throughout the country. So they establish decision making processes. So the field office in San Francisco is going through and making decisions based on the same criteria that the field office in Dallas or Philadelphia is. So the FDA established this really great practice for everybody in all their offices. So now let's go back. That brought us up to speed. And let's go back and look sort of the evolution of patient safety laws. And it has been I said the aim of legislation has slowly expanded, and it has been slow and has been a long time coming. The very first regulations we had were false claims about what was in a drug. The next couple years later was the regulations were about that ingredients could not be false and fraudulent. From there, we moved on to say the drug safety has to be established before marketing. So you have to have labeling that's correct, and it has to be safe before you market it. And then we decided, based on thalidomide, that drug efficacy and drug safety has to be established before marketing. And here's the reference then. I got all of this information from the FDA website. There's a lot of good stuff out there. If you have questions, you know how to find me. I'd love to answer your questions, and I will talk to you soon.